PROWAG is a challenging topic, and there's a lot of material to cover. And we're not going to attempt to cover everything that is in PROWAG, but at least we can give you a highlight of some of the things that we've seen as we've started to dig into this. And these are things that we're going to continue to learn more as we dig deeper. I think everybody, whether you're on an agency side or the city or consultant side, are all going to be learning things, the nuances as we go forward and how the practical implications of all these things are. But for now, we can at least share what we've come up with so far. So just a little bit, just a little bit about myself. I'm principal engineer with Kittleson & Associates, been with Kittleson over 30 years now. My focus area is largely in intersection design, specifically roundabouts is one of my big topic areas. But in the last decade or more, I've been doing a lot of work, research work and implementation work, specifically dealing with pedestrians with vision disabilities. So people who are blind or have low vision, that's been one of my focus areas. So it's a real pleasure to be able to share some of this work and actually some of the research work that had the pleasure of being involved with that has clearly informed final PROWAG, so we can provide some of that context to it. Lisa?
Great, thanks, Lee. Hi, my name is Lisa Strader. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Portland Bureau of Transportation's ADA coordinator, just finishing 4 years in that role. Prior to that, for about 6 years, I was ODOT's ADA program manager and ADA planning manager. So I've been focusing on ADA for about 10 years now. In my role at PBOT, I work with both all the PBOT staff who deliver projects, plan projects, engage with community members, and I hear from community members with disabilities regularly. And so I know there was a lot of excitement when PROWAG was finally released. I had a couple people say that they didn't think that this would, that they'd see this in their lifetime. So especially for people with disabilities, this is just a really exciting piece of guidance and something that I think a lot of us realize we worked around existing guidance to do our best in the public right of way for people who use it differently than I do. I don't identify as somebody who has a disability. So really great to have this guidance. That being said, as we go through the presentation, there are going to be a lot of points where I note that PBOT's still working through this document. Lee mentioned that there's a lot there and it's new. And even though it's been in existence for quite a while, now that it's real and the little adjustments, PBOT's just starting to work through exactly how we're going to implement all of these elements and comparing what PROWAG offers versus what we do now. And we haven't made any kind of wholesale adoption of it. So I'm going to point out when I'm presenting where we're already doing work that meets or exceeds that, where we're still having those conversations, where we're just not sure yet. So I'm really happy to be here, and thanks for the invitation.
So with that, what we've done is we've divided the presentation into two parts. The first part, the bigger part of the two, what's in the final PROWAG. And again, as we mentioned, we're covering some of the highlights that are in there. And then the second part is a lot more of the interpretation. What does it mean? How does it affect our practice, and where are the areas that are still going to be challenges as profession, as an industry, to address PROWAG? There are some hidden gems in there that we've learned about that are going to be a challenge to deal with. So this is how we have divided up the presentation. So I'll go ahead and start with what is in final PROWAG. And to do that, we've kind of divided it into, there's about half a dozen or so major topics that were identified in the preamble to the PROWAG. So that's a bit how we've organized the presentation here, to talk about the pedestrian access routes and the alternate routes. So those would be, for example, during construction. providing pedestrian access routes, crosswalks, accessible pedestrian signals, transit stops, on-street parking. So there's a number of issues related to many of these topics. At the highest level, one of the big questions that you have to face is, first of all, is it a new pedestrian facility or is it an altered pedestrian facility? Because there's a bit of a difference in how those are addressed. New pedestrian facilities must be compliant with PROWAG, but that's where you usually have the greatest level of flexibility. The challenge and the rub that we all know from doing projects is the alterations, where you have constraints. That's where bringing things up to PROWAG when it's an alteration is more challenging. And so that's where they've retained the language to the maximum extent feasible. Now, the access board has been fairly clear that right-of-way is not one of those limitations necessarily that makes access or makes it feasible or not. But, you know, a building corner or something that's in the way, that definitely complies with that, as well as, you know, physical constraints, you know, drop-offs, major drop-offs, things like that. So, you know, there can be things like that, but it really requires careful thinking about, does it apply? Existing pedestrian facilities, you don't have to bring them up quite yet unless you alter the facility. So there's not a requirement to address everything, although there would be an overall transition plan that is needed overall. And that's something that Lisa could talk about a little bit later. What constitutes an alteration? Again, any portion of the pedestrian facility that's altered must be brought up to PROWAG. So, and that's regardless of the scope of the alteration. So even, for example, if the main focus of the project was to add a lane, a travel lane on the roadway, in doing that, if you alter the pedestrian facilities, then you have to bring the pedestrian facilities up to PROWAG. So it doesn't really matter if the focus of the project was not specifically to address pedestrian issues. If you alter the pedestrian facilities in the act of doing the alteration, then you would bring it up to PROWAG. And that's where it gets a little gray as far as where things does it trigger it or not. It's also worth noting here at the end here that altering a facility must be connected to an existing pedestrian circulation path by a pedestrian access route. So an accessible route to connect the alteration to the actual project. And that's something that I think Lisa here can talk about as an example. You're muted, Lisa.
Everyone has to do it at least once. I have yard work going on outside somewhere in the neighborhood, so I didn't want to share the blower noise. Yeah, so here is a picture of Sandy Boulevard. I think it's near 158th, might be 152nd. Anyway, we've got a bus stop on the right side of the image with a couple of people waiting for it. They're standing on a gravel shoulder of the road. There's a telephone pole between that bus stop and getting to the corner there where we've got a crosswalk and a signal with a pedestrian push button. This is what that last bullet point I think that Lee was mentioning is talking about, is being sure that you've got access at both that bus stop and the pedestrian signal in between those two things. So I know that I hear from community members with disabilities this exact kind of situation. I can get myself across the street and then getting to that bus stop, which, you know, there's a lot of places that are served on roads that don't have sidewalks. It's just really challenging for somebody using a mobility device or using a white cane. So I think this part of PROWAG is going to be really helpful. It doesn't say we have to build a full-on sidewalk all the way down Sandy Boulevard here. It says we've got to have access between those 2 points, and that alone will make a big difference for people who need that kind of surface to get between spots. Thanks.
Yeah, so again, this is where it gets tricky. You know, what constitutes an alteration? And this is where PROWAG is actually silent. The draft actually listed some things that would trigger an alteration, but the final rule removed some of those things out of it. So it is silent essentially on what constitutes an alteration. And so it's a little bit left up to the interpretation of the agencies that are involved. And so the way I kind of approach this, if I were asked this question, is PROWAG triggered by this alteration? The question that I have in my mind, and again, this is nothing official from the Access Board, but this is my own interpretation. Does the change to the facility substantially change the pedestrian's experience? So if it does, then you should upgrade the facilities to PROWAG. So some examples of that. Some of these are pretty obvious. If you close a crossing, okay, for whatever reason, if you close the crossing, then you should make sure that the closure of that crossing is brought up to PROWAG standards. And this is something we'll talk about in a little bit. It's one of the new items. What if you do leading pedestrian intervals? Now, I would argue that the communicating the leading pedestrian interval needs to be done equitably to everybody. So it's not just merely doing a signal timing change. It needs to be communicated to all pedestrians equally. And that's where the APS comes into play, to communicate the start of the walk interval, because it's not at the same time as the start of motor vehicle travel. And so that's where the cues are different, and that's where the APS provides information that would otherwise not be given to somebody who is blind or has low vision, where they would normally hear the sound of this vehicles next to them starting, and they would recognize that as being the start of the walk interval. And that's where you run into a problem. If you move, obviously, if you move the push buttons, making them accessible, if you change the direction of vehicular conflicts, if you switch the street around from two-way to one-way or one-way to two-way, that is a fairly big change in the direction of conflicts that a driver might perceive. If you separate bicycle facilities, that's changing the pedestrian experience in some way, then that would be another area where I think that PROWAG, from my professional opinion, I think that PROWAG should be brought into play when you make that kind of an alteration. So there's quite a number of specific dimensions and things that are in the final rule. So we're going to highlight a few of these here. So, you know, continuous clear width, 48 inches. This is nothing new that way. And then it should be 60 inches normally, but if you have passing routes, if you're narrower than that, then they have to be provided certain frequencies and so on. Shared use paths have to be, or they're wider, but you have to be the full width, because there is no way to isolate the pedestrian portion of a full shared use path. So, for example, if you paint a line on a shared use path to somehow designate part of it being for bikes and part of it being for peds, that's inaccessible to somebody who's blind. And so you provide the full width, you treat the whole width of the shared use path as being an accessible route, because there's no way to otherwise distinguish them. So these are, again, there's nothing really new in this portion of the final rule.
Leah, this is Lisa. There's a question in the chat, and we didn't really talk about whether we wanted to take those live or wait. You want me to read it to you?
Yeah, feel free. I can't read the chat.
Yeah, I know it's hard sometimes. So this is, you mentioned adding bike lanes. Is a road diet going to require PROWAG? And I'm not sure whether that whole question got typed or not. So
yeah,
Peter, if you want to.
I would argue that if you're changing the pedestrian experience, then you should bring it up to PROWAG. So again, if part of the road diet is altering the pedestrian facilities, if part of the reason for the road diet is to be able to widen the pedestrian facilities or add buffers or other things between the pedestrians and bicyclists or things like that, in my opinion, I think that would trigger PROWAG. I don't know if you
Great.
have a additional take on that.
No, this is Lisa. I actually hadn't thought that one through yet. So I would like to think that it does. I would like to think that whenever we can, we lean into this new guidance that was, specifically designed, developed by and for people with disabilities. I think that that's going to make it a much more universally usable transportation system. So, but I think for at least for PBOT, that's probably a question yet to be answered. And speaking of PBOT, so just on the screen now, we've got a screenshot out of our pedestrian design guide. The previous slide that Lee was showing identified the 48-inch and the 60-inch new guidance in PROWAG. And we at PBOT use wider than that now as guidance. We know that we have restrictions some places where we just don't have the right of way, or we already have curb tight. We have buildings that are there, or retaining walls, or heritage trees. So we can't always have these widths, but we already strive to have wider pedestrian ways than what PROAG is requiring. So we know that that benefits all pedestrians on our system. Thanks. And also from our PED design guide, we provide specific width guidance related to the different street design classifications. So again, in every case, we exceed what PROAG is requiring now. And our guidance also provides information for other zones in a lot of streets where we've got, the frontage zone near the buildings, the pedestrian through zone, and then a furnishing zone and a curb zone. So just wanted to share some of what PBOT already does. Question in the chat: how does the 48-inch minimum width PAR apply to obstructions like utility and signal poles? So Lee, I'm not sure we covered obstructions in our presentation, and off the top of my head, I don't know what PROAG says about those. Do you?
I think no. I would have to look. I don't want to misspeak to know if 48's the absolute minimum, or if you can drop to 36 for an obstruction. That I don't know that for a fact. So I'd have to look that one up. I don't know right now.
Yeah, thanks. And again, we also didn't talk about this, but we can, I think it's reasonable, assuming that there aren't 1,000 questions, that we could come back to these that we can't answer and pass them back through the meeting organizer to everybody who attended. I think, as Lee and I both mentioned, we're still both learning or figuring all of this out. And even though we've read through it a couple of times, haven't internalized it all yet.
Yeah, so again, kind of going along the same line, actually back on this figure, the pedestrian through zone is what PROAG describes as the pedestrian access route. So that would be kind of the, if you will, the accessible route through the, so it can't include the frontage zone or the furnishing zone where you have these obstructions. So that's where the pedestrian access route has to be unobstructed. It doesn't have to be necessarily in a straight line, but it needs to be unobstructed and to meet the requirements of PROAG. So within the pedestrian access routes grades, and this is in the direction of pedestrian travel, it's basically there's a maximum grade. However, if the street itself is steep, you can, the pedestrian access route can share the grade of the street. You do not have to flatten the street itself. If the entire street is on an 8% grade, that's acceptable, because that's one of those practical limitations. So, and PROAG recognizes that. So, but otherwise 5% is kind of the maximum grade. And then within the crosswalks, it's a similar kind of thing. It's you can match the street grade. You can't make it steeper than the street grade, but you can match the street grade if the street grades are steeper than that. Similarly, if the street is super elevated, and this tends to be more of a state highway issue more than the local streets, but if the state highway was super elevated, that at a super elevation greater than 5%, you can match the super elevation if that's the grade in the direction of pedestrian travel. So similarly, the cross slope, so this is kind of perpendicular to the direction of travel, and this is where the cross slope for the pedestrian is really critical for people in wheelchairs. And so that if you're cross slope, and this is kind of the rationale behind why cross slopes are so important, is so that a person in a wheelchair can actually maintain their alignment through the crossing. If the cross slope is too steep, then it will pull them in the direction of the cross slope. And so that's why there's a 2.1% maximum, which is it's mathematically close, but not exactly a 1:48 slope. So PROWAG actually clarified that to allow for the construction tolerance here is 2.1% if it's measured that way, as opposed to, I think it's 2.08 is the exact number. So that's recognizing there is that the construction tolerances are only so great here. Within crossings, the general thing is, again, if it's stop or yield controlled, then the cross slope is the same 2.1% maximum. If it's uncontrolled or signalized, then it's 5%. And if it's a mid block or crossing at a roundabout, then it can actually match the street grade. And that last point was actually revised as part of the final rule as compared to the draft. So again, these cross slopes, it allows, for example, at the roundabout, because the crossing is set back away from the entrance to the roundabout by a vehicle length or more, that cross slope there can actually match the street grade and does not have to be flattened out. Of course, it is a good idea if you can to flatten it out, but if in our constrained environments, sometimes that's not always possible.
Yeah, so Lee, we're getting more conversation in the chat than I think we can probably reasonably respond to in real time if we're going to get through this. So I apologize to attendees, to the 91 of you who joined us today. Thank you so much. When we get through this, I'll do my best to go back and see which ones we can answer in real time, and we'll otherwise save the chat and do what I said and try to get back to you with those answers to the extent that we can figure them out. So this is a photo of a crosswalk that this is really not so much related to PROWAG. I have to, full disclosure, admit that I'm taking advantage of the fact that there are 90 transportation engineers or related staff on this call, and sharing what I hear from community members with disabilities about general issues that they sometimes experience in the transportation system that we all are responsible for. So this is not a very good photograph either to demonstrate what I'm talking about, but the slope, the curb ramp at this location comes down to the street, and the street goes up dramatically. And so that algebraic difference there at the grade break is extreme. And not only, I think you can tell a little bit that they're, when it's wet, that's probably got a lot of standing water. You can see that to the left of the truncated dome section. But we have, even in some new construction, built what a White Cane user described to me is a roller coaster effect. So they come down the curb ramp and then go up dramatically to even a brand new road. So we are tying in at both ends of this brand new stretch to existing infrastructure, but it's just something that I think would be helpful to be really aware of, how those kind of situations make it really challenging for mobility device users, or maybe even more so for people who can't see that change and have an expectation that is very different than what they experience in these kind of situations. So that was the point of this slide.
And PROWAG does talk about that grade break as well. We didn't specify it in these slides, but it is part of PROWAG. So another kind of, there's plenty of other provisions, but I think it's worth always mentioning here about the changes in level. And that's where, small, up to a 1/4 inch could be vertical, but beyond that, you start having additional requirements as far as beveling or maximum slopes. And if it is even more than 6 inches in level, then it needs to be designed per a ramp. And in PROWAG, they're very specific about what a ramp is versus what a curb ramp is. And that's an important distinction within PROWAG as you're reading it. Curb ramps are those things we know and love at intersections, whereas ramps are basically, you could think of it as a ramp to change elevations within a building. That kind of mental picture of a ramp. So it would have to have landings periodically, flat landings for people, so you don't have a long continuous uphill climb or downhill descent. Those kinds of things, that's what PROWAG specifies as far as ramps versus curb ramps. Horizontal openings for grates to make sure that you can't pass a sphere greater than a 1/2 inch. That's so that a wheel from a wheelchair can't get caught in there and actually get stuck in the grate and things of that sort. That's as an example. Similarly, there are requirements for at-grade rail crossings, and it differentiates a small difference whether it's basically subject to the FRA safety. So think of that freight rail and passenger rail, heavy rail versus light rail, streetcar type of application. So that would be kind of the distinguishing feature here.
Yeah, thank you again, Lee. So as it relates to sidewalks and those pedestrian access routes, just pointing out that the city of Portland, like many jurisdictions, has a city code that puts those responsibilities on abutting land owners, abutting property owners. This photo that I've used is, I would like to say, an extreme situation, but honestly, there's lots of sidewalks in the city of Portland that look like this. You can distinctly see 3 sidewalk panels, and none of them are at the same or a continuous grade, and there are dramatic drops between, heaves and drops between those. So as it relates to PROWAG and any measurements there that change about what makes a sidewalk compliant, I am sure that we will look at changing how we evaluate sidewalks that we have reports of related to PROWAG, and then likely have those be the ones that are out of compliance. Again, we haven't had that conversation through out the Bureau. We've just started our conversations on that, but that's likely, I would guess that's how we will include that in our sidewalk enforcement program. Thanks.
Yeah. Now I want to talk a little bit about alternate pedestrian access routes. So these would be those in construction zones. And so basically you still, if the existing route is accessible, you have to maintain the route during construction. So one of the new provisions here is that, and we were just showing it in the figure here, is this example if you had a mid-block crossing or a mid-block closure, providing the sidewalk itself, if it was a pedestrian access route, you need to provide the alternate route. So that includes ramps down to the street level, a detectable edging along the street level, and then ramp back up to sidewalk level to continue your path. What's new here is that not only do you have to sign it, and it has to be signed to meet the visual requirements within PROWAG, but there also needs to be an audible component. And this is a new thing that was included in the final rule that was not part of the draft. And it's something that we'll talk about a little bit later here, but it basically, you need to communicate verbally to somebody that they have to be able to get this information if they cannot read the sign themselves. So if somebody is blind, they need to be able to get the same information that the sign basically is providing. So that's a new provision that we'll talk about a little bit later, the practical implications of that. Similarly, the route has to have the 48 inches. I touched on some of these already here. So it has to still have the 48 inches. You'd still need to have the passing areas every 200 feet, just like a normal pedestrian access route. Where you cross a curb, you need to provide a curb ramp or a blended transition that meets the curb ramp or blended transition requirements. Channelizing devices need to have continuous detectable edging so that you can pick it up by cane and not just at shoulder, or waist level or 36 inches high. It has to be you have to be able to pick it up at a lower level as well. And then if pedestrian signals are part of the temporary route, that they need to also be accessible. So they'd have to be accessible pedestrian signals, or APSs. So again, and a lot of these things are already part of many design practices already, because a lot of these components were in the draft. That said, there still may be some nuances that are in the new rule that may affect our construction traffic control practices.
So again, not specifically how the city of Portland's going to adopt or address the changes in PROAG to temporary pedestrian access routes, but opportunity to talk about what I hear from people who cannot get around when we interrupt what used to be there, whether it's for a road project or other building projects. This is a photo of a building that's got fencing around it. Not sure if this is a start of a construction project or if the building's condemned and it's unsafe and they're just trying to keep people out of it. There is a sign there that says, I think it says sidewalk closed. This is just recently, like days ago, came to me from my community member that uses a mobility device, and just, kind of what the heck. This isn't really helpful. You don't tell me where I can be. You've got this one sign. You've just put up this fence. So hopefully things that are in PROAG now, and audibility, I think, would be a real benefit, especially to people who are blind or low vision. Again, they come up to something that's completely different and new. They could cross and come up to this sign, but it doesn't tell them anything. It doesn't give them any direction in a way that is effective for them to know what to do. So the PROAG won't, completely change how we implement pedestrian access routes, temporary pedestrian access routes, but the additional guidance should help. And again, just an opportunity for me to say, getting these on paper and having them look really good there doesn't necessarily translate to them working in the field for somebody who uses them differently than I would. And if they're not properly installed or maintained or moved when, a lot of projects, especially road projects, have phases. And so getting phase 1 right, if you don't adjust to phases 2 and 3, isn't really helpful long-term for people who need to get around while we do our work. So thanks.
Talk now a little bit about curb ramps. They are required for each pedestrian crossing, and detectable warning surfaces are of course required at the base of the ramp. Nothing new there. Again, if existing constraints make it infeasible to provide separate curb ramps for each of the pedestrian crossings, then you can use a single curb ramp at the corner, but that's really the exception and not the rule. So we're working our way towards having individual curb ramps dedicated to each pedestrian crossing, because that works so much better for people who have both either mobility disabilities or who are blind or have low vision. Especially, it's very difficult for a person who is blind to use a single curb ramp on the corner and realize that it's serving both pedestrian crossings. So that's why it's desirable to have them separated this way. Again, when you have ramps provided, that you need to provide a landing area so that if somebody in a wheeled device can position themselves above the slope of the ramp, rotate to match the slope of the ramp to be able to go down the slope of the ramp perpendicular to the slope. So this is really, really critical for people with mobility devices to have the landing areas. For example, with a typical perpendicular ramp like you see here, you would need to have the landing area behind the ramp, because otherwise, again, the cross slopes become too steep. And that's where those cross slope requirements that I mentioned earlier come into play. So tops of perpendicular ramps or bottom of parallel ramps. If you lower the entire ramp down because you can't fit in a perpendicular ramp, and this is very common, then the landing area is at the bottom of the ramp, the assumption here. So this ramp here is a beauty, older ramp that doesn't have a landing or detectable warning surface. And of course, we still have plenty of these around our communities. So these landing areas need to be 4 feet by 4 feet. I kind of think of them as a 4-foot circle, but it's specified in PROWAG as a 4 foot by 4 foot square. And then the cross slope within that square needs to be, again, the 148 or 2.1%. Ramp widths themselves need to be 48 inches minimum for a typical curb ramp. If it's shared use, though, then they need to match the width of the shared use path. So if you bring in a 10-foot wide shared use path into a curb ramp, you can't put a 48-inch wide curb ramp at the base of that. It needs to be widened to match the width of the entire shared use path. That was part of the supplemental draft to PROWAG that came out specific to shared use paths. So there's nothing new in this from the draft to the final, but it was part of the supplemental draft that came out a year or two later after the original draft. So what this means, for example, at roundabouts, where it's been fairly common practice up to this point to use shared use paths around the perimeter of a roundabout, and we could talk further about that if we have time, but those shared use paths, the ramps, need to match the width of the shared use path. So that requires the wider ramps.
Yeah, this is Lisa again. So we have this PBOT is operating under a consent decree. So we have language in that court-approved document that talks about us using the 2010 ADA standards to build curb ramps that meet the requirements of that agreement. So this is another one of those places where we have to talk through whether or not PROWAG will supersede that, especially because it doesn't become official guidance for some time. We have plaintiffs that we feel like we need to go back to and talk to. So we just want to recognize that for the city of Portland, at least for right now, we have guidance that we follow related to curb ramps that may or may not meet all the requirements of PROWAG, and we may or may not going forward do anything differently through the life of that agreement because of that. And just, I love this graphic, which I will give credit to former US Access Board staff member, current FHWA accessibility resource, that just really, I think, so clearly demonstrates the benefit of 2 curb ramps. So here we are, got a corner with diagonal curb ramps, 2 corners, and I'm walking to lunch with a friend of mine who uses a wheelchair. And I can walk straight across. I can step down one curb and back up on the other. And my friend who's using their wheelchair has to take this route to head to lunch with me. And 1, it's longer, and 2, it puts them into the paths of vehicles a lot longer than it puts me into that. They're likely a lot more profile than I am, and so maybe less visible. They're walking with someone in this example, so maybe a driver is going to notice at least the person that's walking upright and not miss the fact that there's somebody in their path of travel. But if they were by themselves, or even if it's a dark, gray, rainy day, that just puts that person at more of a risk in vehicle traffic than is necessary, and that 2 curb ramps would provide for. Thanks.
Yeah, to continue the crosswalks, one of the requirements here that has been part of roundabout design actually for over 20 years now is providing the providing the back buffer basically between the crossings next to the circulatory roadway. So anywhere where at the intersection where the pedestrian crossing is not intended or it's prohibited, then you would provide this buffer. And in PROWAG, it was specified as either a landscaping, or what they've added here is this other non-prepared surface. Now that's undefined within PROWAG. The language says right now that they're going to be able to provide further guidance on this in the future here, but at the moment it's undefined what non-prepared surface is. My interpretation has always been that a non-prepared surface would be something like it's landscaping or gravel or other loose surfaces, or otherwise not a comfortable walking surface. So a really rough cobblestone. A smooth cobblestone could be a walking surface. Brick certainly is a walking surface. Stamped or painted concrete certainly is a walking surface. Asphalt's a walking surface. So it's clearly not those. So it's really something that is distinctly different from what would be considered a normal walking surface. That's my interpretation, but again, PROWAG is a little bit undefined right now what it specifically means for non-prepared. What is new, however, here, well, and they also revised, they said fencing in the draft. Now the final rule just gives more of a specification. You have a lower, the bottom edge is no more than 15 inches above the surface. So that's kind of a refined way of presenting the vertical option. What's new, and this is a big deal, is it's not just intended at roundabouts, but it applies to any intersection where you have closed a leg of the intersection. So if you have closed one of the 4 crossings of an intersection, you have to communicate that closure in an accessible way. And this is the way it's communicated at roundabouts. And so this is the same thing that they have specified for other types of intersections. So what this means here is that just simply signing it closed is not sufficient. And that's a really big deal here. And we have plenty of these kinds of intersections around where we have crosswalks that are closed. And so how to communicate that in an accessible way is a really important part.
Yeah, so this is a sign that actually PBOT doesn't use anymore. It's like an upside down coat hanger to close a crossing, and certainly white cane users talk about how easy it is to miss that one pole there. We now use something more like a staple with a bar across the bottom that's much more detectable. But even so, these even our new ones aren't what especially people who are blind or low vision would call fully accessible. It doesn't tell them where to go. It says, oh, look, there's a barrier here, but it doesn't give them guidance about, how to find the accessible route now. So I don't know that PROWAG specifically identifies that, although some of the language that Lee just highlighted, I think leans into saying, don't just put up a barrier, but give guidance on, where the route is. But that's just something that I know people would really like designers to be aware of, is just telling them where they can't go, just telling them they can't cross here might keep them safe from crossing where they shouldn't, but it doesn't necessarily get them to where they need to get. If they still need to get to the other side of the street here, giving them guidance about how they can safely do that is needs to be part of how we close an area. Thanks.
Yeah, and this obviously has big ramifications on our bigger arterial streets. So this is not a small deal for how to deal with this issue, but it is one that we're going to have to deal with. And the intention here is to provide equal communication of the information to the pedestrian, regardless of their ability. And so that's what our charge is from the Access Board, and it's up to us to figure out how it applies to our given project. For multi-lane roundabouts, I wanted to talk about this one here. This is just in general with the multi-lane roundabouts, or actually more, let me rephrase it. In general with roundabouts, the challenge that we have faced, and there's a lot of research that backs this up, that people who are blind or have low vision can really struggle at certain kinds of roundabouts. The roundabout itself, because of the nature of the circulatory roadway, you very frequently have a constant level of background traffic. Even if you have stopping and yielding on the entries, you still have a continuous flow of vehicles happening somewhere in the roundabout. That just creates a background level of noise that never really breaks, turning off and on like you get when you switch at a signalized intersection, for example. So it becomes very difficult for somebody who is waiting for a gap. You basically have to wait for the entire roundabout to clear before you really can hear a gap. So that's a big deal. The other, some of the other challenges that people who are blind have is that because the traffic is not coming at right angles everywhere, there's the curvature of the roundabout, which is doing its job. It's creating slower speeds. It's reducing conflicts by, the severe conflicts, is doing all the stuff that a roundabout's supposed to do. But that curvature makes it difficult to understand with the alignment where the vehicles are coming from and headed to. So these create the additional challenges for somebody who's blind. The crosswalks are set back away from the roundabout, which is a very good thing from an overall pedestrian safety perspective, well documented. But it's because of that, the vehicle speeds can be a little bit higher there. And on the exit side, they can be accelerating. And so that affects the driver yielding behavior. Now, all of those things happen at any roundabout. Some single lane roundabouts, this becomes really challenging for people who are blind, but other single lane roundabouts, it's fine. But multi-lane roundabouts introduce the next layer of challenge, which is the multiple threat. And that, when you combine it with the other things, makes a multi-lane roundabout especially difficult for somebody to cross who is blind or has low vision. And so that's where a lot of the motivation behind the requirements for multi-lane roundabouts has come about. So with that, the draft specified you have to have a traffic control signal with a pedestrian head. You have to have basically a red indication. And the final rule expanded this requirement to cover some additional items. So it not only covers a pedestrian signal, but it also includes a pedestrian hybrid beacon, or PHB. It includes the rectangular rapid flashing beacon, the RRFB. Also includes a raised crosswalk, or some combination thereof. You could combine, for example, an RFB and a raised crosswalk, and that would be fine. But it has to be from that list to make the crossing accessible. The PROWAG is silent on which one to use. And that's something that I'll talk about a little bit later. There is research on how to do that selection process. The research, first of all, helped to document the problem and expanded the range of solutions. So it's nice to see that the research that's happened over the past decade has informed the final rule, which is very good. It's gratifying to see that. It's silent on single lane crossings. It doesn't mean that all single lane roundabouts are okay. Some single lane roundabouts, just like some single lane channelized right turn lanes, could have accessibility challenges, and the guidance that's in 834 and CHRP report 834 can be used to help define whether that's going to be a problem or not. So you could make that assessment if you would like to for the single lane roundabout or single lane channelized turn lane. But PROWAG specifically applies only to the multi-lane roundabout crossing and the multi-lane channelized turn lane. Anything you wanted to add to this information, Lisa?
So Lee, with your work with blind and low vision community members, or your focus on that, I think you covered everything that I would have said about the challenge that I hear from people, especially blind and low vision community members with roundabouts. So no, thanks.
Okay. Continuing at the intersection, pedestrian signals, all new and altered pedestrian signal heads need to also have APS, which of course is at the button. And the APS has not only the audible communication, but also vibrotactile. So it's providing not only for folks for people who are blind or have low vision, but also who have audible or auditory difficulties. And you can use it for alignment. So again, that's and that you would require an additional push button if the pedestrian clearance interval to cross the intersection is only designed to get you halfway across the intersection. So then you would need an additional accessible push button out there in the median. A new provision in the final rule, and I want to give a hat tip to Peter Kuntz, who at the City of Portland, who pointed this out, I think, in the ITE traffic listserv, and I started thinking about this and scratching my head and realized this is a big deal. When the signal is operating in flashing mode, PROWAG requires that the locator tone remain active and that there's a speech message that indicates that the signal is in flash. Now, from a practical standpoint, the way our APSs are currently used right now, they're taking power from the pedestrian signals and they're required to go dark during flashing operations. So there's no power at the APS to communicate with, nor does the APS know which mode the signal is in, because the signal could be in a planned flash from the controller, or it could be in an unplanned flash from the cabinet if there's a malfunction. So these are some kind of important technical details that are still going to need to be sorted out. This is where the MUTCD language and where PROWAG comes into play, how these are going to pair together, but it's more than that. It's how our NEMA standards for signal controllers, our cabinet standards, how all this stuff actually gets assembled in our controller cabinets to make this provision active. But getting back to the why, it's again, the intent here is to communicate the same amount of information that somebody who can see and somebody who cannot see. That's the intent behind PROWAG. And so now it's up to us as an industry to get caught up and make this thing happen. Pedestrian signal timing, again, nothing new here, 3.5 feet per second. Walking speed, walk intervals, 7 seconds. Again, this has been around in the draft for a long time. It's been practice in many places for quite some time. So nothing new specifically in this area.
This is just a couple photos of a location where we've replaced City of Portland's replaced a signal with more compliant level landing, reach height, and audibility for recently, regardless of PROWAG. And again, haven't had the conversation through PROWAG other than recently we did, based on, I think, Peter's acknowledgement, realize that there's some things that aren't available on the market yet to address the new PROWAG standards for pedestrian signals. I do also just want to shout out to Peter and his team for my experience with them and the handoff that I do of community members who need those maybe longer signal times as an example, and how well the PBOT signal and street lighting staff work with them to make those locations safer, regardless of whether we can make major infrastructure changes or whether or not, we're going to be able to do what PROWAG requires right away. We still do our best to get them around the areas that they need to in the safest way possible, with making some adjustments to what is already there. So it's a really important part of accessibility with all these guidelines. Still working with the people who need it most is often the most critical step to complying with the guidance. Thanks.
Just a little bit about on-street parking. That aside from residential areas, there need to be accessible parking spaces within a block face, and the number that you need depends on the total number of designated parking spaces. So on-street parking and their dimensions that I'll share just briefly here, but essentially that you in commercial areas or anywhere other than residential, that the accessible requirement for accessible parking spaces comes into fore here. Again, it's when you alter the facility, you don't have to add them as right off the bat, but if you alter the parking in the area, then that's where the accessible parking spaces would come into play. So I could think of an example where you're doing, if you're altering the parking as part of a road diet, then perhaps you should be considering how you're providing accessible parking as replacement for the parking, if parking is still going to be allowed on that particular block face. Or if you are providing a curb extension and you remove parking at the corner, you're altering the parking on that block, and you need to then bring that particular block face up to accessible standards. Accessible parking spaces, there's a lot in PROWAG as far as dimensions and things like that. I just want to highlight a couple of things. It's useful to think of it's a larger dimension, and the larger dimension is somewhat flexible to allow the driver to position the vehicle in wherever they need to position it to allow accessible access to the vehicle. Some vehicles will take access from the passenger side. Some vehicles will take access from the rear. Some vehicles will be taking it from the driver's side because it is the driver themselves that are actually needing the accessible access. So that's where these dimensions it's more of a larger dimension to cover these different scenarios. And then the accessible space needs to have a clear area on the sidewalk next to it. And the middle 50% of that space needs to be clear. And that's a real challenge in some of our cases, especially in a retrofit, making sure that you don't have any signs or parking meters or trees or other obstructions within that middle 50% so that they can extend ramps out from the vehicle.
Yeah, this is a photo of Hawthorne Street. We had a project there maybe about 2 years ago now, where we took advantage of the fact that we were there to add some accessible parking spaces. So I think Lee mentioned transition plans earlier in the presentation. PBOT developed an ADA Title II public right-of-way transition plan as a requirement of our consent decree around curb ramps. City of Portland has had a transition plan that the transportation elements have been a part of for Really, they developed it in the 90s, which is pretty early relative to when everyone was supposed to do it that quickly, but a lot of times that didn't happen. City of Portland was able to do that, but the conversation with the community members who use mobility devices who were calling us out about not having curb ramps that were accessible to them identified that transportation is a huge part of the city of Portland, and that having a couple paragraphs in the city of Portland's transition plan just wasn't enough. So we now have our own standalone transition plan for the transportation system. When we were developing that, we recognized that there really weren't applicable, accessible parking standards. So we consciously decided to start using the PROWAG standards 2+ years ago, and have proactively been adding spaces when we can. So this is an example of that. We also have a survey online that's available for people to let us know where they need an accessible parking space in a commercial district. And we have a request program for if I have an accessible vehicle and I really need a parking space in my neighborhood. It won't have my name on it as reserved for me, but it recognizes that having one there would make it more likely that I would have a space to park close to my home than just hoping that the whole curb line wasn't parked up. So for PBOT, what is going to be different is that we don't have that level landing currently in our guidance about next to the middle 50% of a vehicle. The picture that I'm showing you, that's not an issue. We're on a street where the furnishing zone is a hardscape, but in a lot of cases, we've got landscaped areas where we're going to have to address that. We also try to get accessible parking spaces at corners, but that's not always possible. This isn't back far enough to show you, but this isn't on a corner. I think there's a parking space or two behind this this accessible space. So we're still going to have to look at all of those things to provide these in the best way that we can for the people who use them. Thanks.
It's worth pointing out that PROWAG still retains the language that's been part of ADA from the very beginning, which is the equivalent facilitation clause. I mean, alternative designs that result in something that's substantially equivalent or greater accessibility and usability is okay. Again, PROWAG provides minimum technical standards. It's not providing the anything. You can meet it or exceed it. And how, if there's a different way to meet it or exceed it, that is perfectly okay. That meets the intent behind equivalent facilitation. Of course, it's up to you to demonstrate that it does meet it or exceed it. And that's where having performance measures and other things can help with that. And that's where the decision at roundabouts, for example, whether to use a channelized or raised crosswalk or rectangular rapid flash beacon or PHB, there are performance measures that were developed as part of the research work to help make those decisions. So that's where, equivalent facilitation can, you have some flexibility that way. But these minimum technical standards is where the access board has kind of drawn a line and said, you got to at least do this much. And it's still a pretty big lift, as you can see from the conversation here. So what does this mean for design and implementation? And a fair number of these things we've already talked about. So I'm just going to kind of highlight a few of these things in summary. But basically, every PROWAG is silent on what constitutes an alteration. So it's going to come down to the implementation. And there's a step in the approval process right now. PROWAG has been adopted as final rule by the Access Board, but the next step is that the DOT and the DOJ, the Departments of Transportation and Justice, US DOT and US DOJ, have to adopt it. That's what makes it enforceable. And then the agencies, can adopt it from that point forward. Even right now, agencies can adopt the final rule in whatever form, but it's going to be a little bit of discretion right now. And of course, the discretionary components will get adjudicated in the courts if it comes to that. So this is where it's a little fuzzy at the moment. It may get clearer as this implementation and the adoption process carries forward over this next year. FHWA is looking at this coming spring to do their adoption process from what we've learned from them. APS, again, we've already touched on this one a little bit here. Again, I would argue that if you're altering the pedestrian experience, then you should be upgrading the pedestrian signals to include APS. That's my interpretation. PROWAG is silent on what exactly triggers APS. So that again may come into the implementation process and the adoption process if specific standards. ODOT, for example, could say this is what we're going to do and we're going to require for our facilities the exact triggers. But up to this point, PROWAG is silent on that. I think the ramps and the slopes like this is something that if anybody has had to take out an existing ramp because the slopes don't meet the specs, it can be expensive. And so designing things to not be right to the wire, but providing a little bit of buffer in your design so that you have some tolerance for construction variations, which are inevitable. That will reduce the likelihood that you have to come back and redo existing ramps that were just put in, but don't have the correct cross slopes or grades. So again, I would try to design to the extent possible to have a little bit of cushion so that you can flex a bit when you're actually building your projects. The METCD used to be referenced in PROWAG. The provisions that the Access Board wanted from the METCD, they put in the final rule itself. So we now do not know what's going to be in the next edition of the METCD. It's still pending. We could potentially see it this coming month. We'll have to wait and see. I know that the National Committee on Uniform Traffic Control Devices is anxiously awaiting the 11th edition to start reviewing it and seeing what all needs to be done going forward. But for now, this will be a wait and see. But the Access Board chose to not reference the future METCD that doesn't exist yet, but instead to take the provisions that they wanted. And again, in some cases, like with the flashing signals, we have a bit of a conflict that will need to be resolved. We'd mentioned that the flashing APS is for flashing, the audible signs for temporary pedestrian access routes. These are, to my knowledge, don't exist today in the commercial market. So the market's going to have to catch up. So again, some of these items that we see here are setting the standard by which we're going to achieve. How this affects our implementation, it's an open question right now, but I think it's worth raising that it's more than just simply following the standard. It's some of the stuff the industry, our vendors will need to catch up. What about other tactile warning services? The Access Board continues to specify the use of detectable warning surfaces, but is silent on the raised bars, the tactile directional indicators, or the raised trapezoids, the tactile warning delineators, which are being used, starting to see some use now for improving the guidance for people who are blind or have low vision, for locating crossings, aligning to cross, and keeping them separated from bicycles at the same grade. These are the uses of these other devices, but for now, PROWAG is silent on that. The Access Board is very interested in these topics. They're looking at them. They're part of ongoing TCRP research related to this, but for now, PROWAG is silent on everything except for the detectable warning surfaces. So there is some guidance. I mentioned that TCRP report. It's in the final report the project will be finished by the end of December. So there will be a new report coming out next year on tactile wayfinding for transit applications and for street crossing applications. So that will provide some additional guidance. And there's existing research reports to address crossing solutions for roundabouts and channelized turn lanes, report 834, and then of course the roundabout guide, the brand new one that came out earlier this year. carries that a little bit further for roundabouts. So there is some basis there to help make those decisions, or to help you with that decision process of how to treat crossings at roundabouts.
Yeah, the city of Portland has a lot of guidance that we use already. This is a screenshot of our transition plan cover on the left there. So city council adopted that on the in July of 2021, middle of the pandemic. That was so interesting to get the outreach done for that. Also a screenshot of our schedule for compliance. So there's a lot that we know about the assets that we're responsible for, but as it relates to their accessible elements, we don't always know that. So for instance, on transit stops, we both have an overlap of responsibility for some of those with TriMet, and we need to decide what it is that we say when we are talking about whether or not they're compliant. Similarly with pedestrian signals, we might know how many we have, we might know whether or not they're audible, but the asset management system that we use didn't talk about whether or not there was a level landing, whether or not, how high the pedestrian signal was situated at, and how close you could get to it. So the reach, height, landing issues. So we recognized that there was going to be time when we were going to need to learn some things before we could literally start making progress. So that's why we've delayed some of that specific progress work. And also, to this point, we don't have specific, like we're doing these sidewalks or these pedestrian signals this year. So that's why our schedule shows more percentages, not specific numbers. We don't know those numbers yet, and we don't have specific projects necessarily. Next slide. Also mentioned a couple of these documents in as reference in some of the slides I had. So PED PDX is our pedestrian plan. Gives a lot of, there was a question earlier about whether or not sidewalks are required under PROWAG where they don't exist, and they're not, although that connection piece of an accessible route between accessible elements, like so between a transit stop and a crosswalk, are required, but there isn't a requirement. There still isn't a requirement to build a sidewalk where there isn't one. Our pedestrian plan, the City of Portland's pedestrian plan, recognizes how important it is to have sidewalks where there aren't any. And so we do prioritize those, but not, and they definitely benefit somebody with a disability, but they're not a ADA or a PROWAG requirement. Portland Pedestrian Design Guide gives more standards and measurements and specifics. And then the third screenshot here is that survey that I mentioned of accessible parking spaces. So it both on a map shows where we have them, which full disclosure, that's not an accessible element for somebody who can't see it. Maps notoriously are very difficult, are not regularly accessible, and City of Portland's working on that with our platforms. But it also then has a opportunity back to the survey for somebody to let us know where they need a pedestrian, or an accessible parking space. And with that slide, that's it.
So kind of in closing, I think for me, the takeaway from reviewing PROWAG and working in this space is I know I can, opening my professional eyes to making sure that the designs that we do work for everybody is really kind of the fundamental takeaway here. This is PROWAG is providing kind of the legal framework that says this is what you got to do as a minimum, but best practice and doing the right thing, I still think is the way it should guide how we practice. How do we best protect this safety, health, and welfare of the public as professional engineers? I think meeting PROWAG should be an inherent part of what we do. So that's, you know, and improving access for all modes of travel the same way, but making sure when we do improve the access for other modes, for example, we improve our bicycle facilities, which is awesome to do, that we don't do it at the expense of pedestrians. And PROAG kind of sets a minimum floor for what we need to be doing for pedestrians. And so that's my own personal takeaway from PROAG. Lisa, anything?
Yeah, I just think there's so, I think I mentioned earlier, so many people who have been waiting for this that, you know, it's specifically identified for, and it's definitely lots of questions still to be answered and details to be worked out, but the just alone, like that representation matters, just that finally there's something that recognizes that the public right of way needs to be accessible is a huge step in the right direction for people who, like the person on this slide, is using a white cane. So Jason, I don't know if you were wanted to facilitate questions, if you want me to go through the chat, whatever you want to do, go for it.
I'll do my best to go through the chat. I know that some questions were answered as we were walking through it, and also answered just by your guys' presentation. Thank you again, by the way. That was excellent information. We really appreciate your time today. I'll hit some of these at the bottom. If anyone's got some questions that were maybe towards the top, or if you've been holding on to them until the end, this is the time to pop them into the chat. I know that there was one question about APS, asking for clarification on if APS is only required for temporary crossings where there was APS there before or not. Did you guys happen to get that one answered?
APSs would be required if the temporary pedestrian access route uses the APS. So
Okay.
if you are, for example, let's take the example that I showed there where you're on one side of the street and you have a mid-block closure. And so for a person to continue on that sidewalk, they have to cross the street twice, let's say, rather than having a path within the closure. But if the temporary route was to actually have to cross the street to the other side of the street, that crossing that would need to have an APS per PROAG.
Okay, great. I've got one here from Randy. It looks like it's for Lisa. It seems like there's a vast nature of the remediation work may require more than 10 to 20 years to fund and implement. Does this plan address any flexibility in this realm?
Yeah, thanks, Randy. We do have a requirement to update that plan every 5 years, and the recognition is that that schedule will probably move out when we do that. And so we know that it may, you know, it'll very likely take longer than 20 years. So yes, we'll update the schedule every 5 years.
Excellent. I've got a couple here.
For what it's worth, PROAG took 30.
I got a question that I just kind of wrote down here. What part of the rule do you think is most impactful to projects that both of you personally work on, Lee and Lisa?
Ooh, I had not thought of that one.
I think
Lee, if you know, go for it.
Well, I think a big, obviously, I mean, I do a lot of work in the roundabout space. And so the multi-lane crossings, finally, instead of just saying, okay, we're just going to put in conduit and figure it out later is now. So now it's not good enough to just put in conduit for the crossings. But from my perspective, addressing the wayfinding issue of knowing that a crosswalk is closed, not only at a roundabout, but at every other kind of intersection that we have, you know, where every intersection is a legal crossing, that's a pretty big deal, especially on our bigger arterials. I think we're going to, I'm thinking of the Barber Boulevards of the world and other arterials where we have lots of little minor streets that don't have their own crossings designated crossing Barber Boulevard. We need to communicate in an accessible way that those crossings are not available. And that is, I think, is going to require looking. I mean, I think we're going to probably seeing more vertical treatments because we don't have the space to do horizontal treatments. And so I think we're going to start seeing more of those kinds of things. That's my hunch in retrofit situations.
Yeah, and this is Lisa. So from me, I think those connections between accessible elements is going to be a really important element, and maybe not as challenging as some other things, but just the recognition that, you know, you're letting people off a bus and then you're expecting them to figure out how to get to a crosswalk. And for me, I can say, okay, well, that's 50 feet from here. I mean, I don't even think about it. I just go there. But we need to provide those routes. So again, not complete, redo everything, but just those little connection pieces that I think will make a big difference for people who need it most.
Nice. I got one here from Scott Miller. What do you see as the biggest challenges with public agency compliance, i.e., are there requirements that are so difficult to comply with that it can't reasonably be done with public agency type funding?
So this is Lisa. To this point, I think the most challenging is going to be something like the pedestrian signals, where the guidance requires us to provide something that doesn't exist on the market yet today. I think the PROWAG guidance, and I may have engineers on the call that disagree with me, but I mean, we were already pretty challenged with what a lot of this is going to cost, which isn't an excuse not to do it. Absolutely not. You know, roads cost a lot. Traffic signals for vehicles cost a lot. So the fact that it costs a lot to make the system complete for everybody that uses it I'm not saying that as an excuse at all. So I don't know that there's anything in PROAG that makes it that much more onerous than what was there before, from my perspective.
Yeah, and then from my perspective, I think the only thing and it's not really PROAG that's driving this, but it's the responsibility that many agencies place on the adjacent property owners to maintain the pedestrian facilities. And I think that'll be something that balance of who's responsible for the pedestrian facility within the public right of way, as we try to bring things up to standard, and who needs to pay for that, either directly as a property owner or indirectly through your property taxes. I think that one way or another, that's going to come to a head, and we'll see where that all shakes out. But that's going to affect agencies all over the United States.
Definitely. And it looks like Randy just put a quick follow-up, so I thought I'd shout it out since I can't unmute anybody. He said that it seems that planning projects and budgeting the content of a project in this realm makes project's budget look different and required better planning in the prospectus stage. So I think that's pretty good feedback. Another question here: will figures and images be provided like they were in the previous version?
From what I understand from the Access Board staff is that, yeah, everybody wants the figures, and they are planning to work on figures, but the text is the legal requirement. So the figures are not the official version; they're supplemental to the legal version. The written word that's in the Federal Register is the legal requirement. So everything that's supplemental to that, which is in the Federal Register, is forthcoming, as from what I understand from the Access Board.
Yeah, I am personally going to miss the commentary. I don't think that's what it was called exactly in the draft version, right? The advisory. I just thought that was so helpful. But Randy McCourt earlier in the chat noted that the Access Board website does have some examples of what constitutes a modification. So hopefully they're maybe still going to do some of that kind of information providing, because at least for me, that is so much more helpful than some, I mean, sometimes language, I get it right away, but so often it's like, show me what that looks like. Even just one example, even if there's so many different variations of that, give me one, and then I can start from there. So I hope that even if it's not official, if it's informal, that they might still provide that kind of, for me, benefit, for me and maybe
Yeah.
people like benefit.
And or, partnering, this is where ITE can play a role, similar to what they do, with the Traffic Control Devices Handbook and its relationship to the METCD. So, I mean, there are opportunities, where it's, whether or not it's official from the access board. I mean, I think as professional community, we can be part of that, providing the guidance. And I think the access board, I can't speak for them, of course, but my sense from talking with them is that they would welcome the partner.
Definitely. All right, we got about 3 minutes left. If anyone's got some last minute questions, this is the last call for questions. Otherwise, we can let you all go about your day. I think Randy also mentioned, folks may not have picked up on this, but for parking, the old wheel stops graphic is gone, and use of a bollard is noted, avoiding the trip issues of wheel stops in the pedestrian space. I think that's all the
Definitely
questions we're
tripped over
gonna
those.
Yeah, me as well. Thank you again, Lee. Thank you again, Lisa, for giving us your time today. We really, really appreciate it. I think Lisa noted if any questions didn't get asked in time, or if you guys on the drive home from work or wherever you'll be, come up to you. Lisa's offered her email, lisa.strader@portlandoregon.gov. I believe we'll have Lee's email as well in the information we send out. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us. I look forward to the next one.
Thanks so much. Have a great day, everybody. Bye.
Yep.